So I hope that we can get into a bit of a dialogue this morning. I'm going to go through some slides that will sort of outline a case for how Iceland can be an innovator in internet policy as a way of attracting economic investment and development in Iceland. Before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm here and why I have an interest in this, and I hope that that'll sort of frame the conversation. So I'm a venture capital investor. I work at a fund in New York City called Union Square Ventures. We're a fund that's about 10 years old. We have, for the last 10 years, been investing in internet services. So that's not the chips and the routers and the hardcore technical infrastructure of the internet. It's the services that ride on top of the internet. So some of the services that you might have heard of are companies like Twitter and Tumblr and Foursquare, Kickstarter, Lending Club. These are all essentially networks. They're lots of people call them social networks. They're networks of human beings connected over the internet, providing some service. As a result of being involved in these networks, we have begun to understand that we have to be conscious of the policy framework within every jurisdiction in which we're operating. And it hasn't always been true. Historically, venture capital investors have been very apolitical. They've been apart from the political process, not particularly interested in policy because they were working on hard technology, chips, routers, and things like that. And those, a 10% faster chip doesn't really affect anything in the policy area. But once you move up to the applications layer, all of the stuff that you do, so if, for instance, I think I can go back here. If you think about all of these businesses, for example, Halo is an e-hail taxi service. And the minute you offer an alternative way of hailing a taxi, there's a whole bunch of there's a regulatory framework that manages the existing taxi environment, for instance, in major cities around the world. And this sometimes conflicts with that. If you think about Lending Club is a peer-to-peer lending service that allows any individual to lend money to any other individual. And it dramatically lowers the cost of providing that service. And as a result, it actually creates a challenge for existing incumbents, banks in those markets, because it's providing a service at a lower cost. And the regulators in those markets don't quite know what to make of these networks. It's not exactly a bank, and yet it's providing a service similar to a bank. And so we've become quite involved in these conversations. So the reason for coming to Iceland is that we believe that there's an opportunity here in Iceland to be a leader in innovation around some of these regulatory policies. And I want to be sort of very direct about our interests because it's a little bit confusing. Okay, so I'm an investor, I'm a venture capitalist. I have been involved over the last couple of years in policy discussions in the US. Why come to Iceland? Well, let me actually keep diving in for a minute. I believe that Iceland is very well positioned to become a hub of innovation. And if I think about, and I know that this is a bit of the exercise that David's going to run, that what Iceland might look like in 2020, I believe it could be a global hub for internet-based, network-based innovation. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, lots of reasons that you already know about. You have relatively inexpensive electricity, you have relatively inexpensive air conditioning, you have an existing investment in data centers, you have existing examples of cloud-based services like Green Cloud that have a global reach today. And you have a well-educated population, you have a very high penetration of internet services. I think Iceland has one of the highest levels of usage of Facebook of any country in the world. So it's well positioned. You also have good connectivity to the rest of the world. I think it's an area that we have to continue to think about because there are some limitations to the connectivity to the US as an example. Connectivity to Europe, as I understand, is better. So All of those reasons say it's well positioned to attract investment in data first. So I would expect that more and more people will recognize that this is an attractive place to store data and to run processes on that data because of the cost of electricity. Eventually, I think you have an opportunity to attract web services, and this will get into this whole question of whether or not you can create a very slightly differentiated policy environment which makes this Iceland particularly attractive as a place to host your web service and perhaps serve a global market from here. And ultimately, I think you have an opportunity to build startups here that have a global reach. Now, I think Bala from Green Cloud is already reaching a global market. Gudjon from Oz intends to reach a global market from here. And I think that there will be, obviously, you have existing examples like CCP Games, which are reaching a global market. So all of those reasons, I believe that you should expect that Iceland can serve a global market in the next few years. So why does this opportunity exist now? All of you are probably familiar with some of the transformations that are taking place in the global economy, but what we see happening is fundamental change in all of these markets. So it used to be that that investors in technology were essentially making the infrastructure incrementally faster. Now the investments are actually having a significant impact on areas like education. So you may have heard the term MOOC, a massive open online course. So we're now seeing, instead of teaching 30 people around a seminar table, there are teachers putting these courses up online and teaching 300,000 people around the world. And that's going to continue to change the way we educate people. I mentioned Lending Club, a peer-to-peer lending service that allows anybody to lend to anybody else without the intermediary of a bank. This is an Airbnb. It's a housing service, or it's a hotel service essentially, that allows anybody to rent out a room to anybody else, again, through a network as opposed to through an existing infrastructure like a hotel. This, I believe, is a picture of one of the Airbnb opportunities in Iceland. And then you have other areas like 3D printing, where you're creating marketplaces for designs for things that can be printed, again, globally. So this is an example of a B2B context. A lot of the services that I mentioned, whether it's Airbnb or Uber, which is an e-hailing service, or Lending Club, they are consumer services, right? And so most people think of the consumer web as being so revolutionary, but there are also networks in business-to-business context. This is one that links music creators, musicians with producers and venues, and helps manage the career of users. There are other examples. We're investors in a company called Pollenware, which is actually a marketplace for receivables. So if you're familiar with the way that people currently finance their receivables, if you're a small supplier to a big retail chain like a Walmart, you always have a cash flow crunch because Walmart always pays you late and you have to pay early. And so what Pollenware does is it allows you as a small supplier to actually ask all of your buyers if any one of them is interested in paying you a couple of days early or a week early. And so instead of going to a bank and borrowing against that, you can go to your suppliers and actually borrow against that. And the problem with doing that historically is that there was no way to create a market. But if you sell to 4 or 5 different retailers, then you can find out which of them is willing to offer you the best price in this marketplace. It's a very liquid marketplace, and it allows people to lower the cost of capital and increase lower the working capital costs for them. So that's an example of a network or network economics in a business context. So all of this is a big deal. We really do believe that that these are very fundamental changes in the global economy. A lot of people compare the transition that we're going through to, to the transition that we saw with the invention of the printing press. And it's overstated in lots of ways, but if you think about it, that was a very dramatic transition. I would argue that moving from a model where most services are provided by corporations, they're provided by organizations organized as industrial hierarchies and delivering services to customers who pay for those services, has been the model for the last 150 years. And we're now moving into much more of a networked-based model where just by linking the creator of the service to the consumer of the service across a network, you can lower the cost of providing that service dramatically. That is a big transition. So why do I think there's an opportunity for Iceland? As I mentioned very early in this conversation, these networks challenge regulators because they don't really know what to do with these new services. Do I define Airbnb as a hotel? Right? So do I require anyone who rents out a spare bedroom to have a fire stair, inspections monthly, all of the things that hotels have to do? Or do I look at Airbnb as just a network providing a connection between someone who's offering a spare bedroom to someone who's looking for a place to stay? So is it a network or is it a hotel? Is Lending Club a bank? Or is it just a network that links a borrower and a lender? These are really hard problems for regulators. And they're not getting it right now. Worldwide, they're not getting it right. So here's an example that happened a few months ago in the US where the state of Minnesota outlawed free online education. And you think, okay, wait a minute. Why would anybody think that they should not make this education available to their citizens in the state of Minnesota? Well, the answer is you've got a regulatory body whose job it is to make sure that every educational offering meets a standard, and that students are not being ripped off. And so there's a certification process, there's a review process, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, this course is being offered in my state. It hasn't gone through my certification process. It's not legal, right? So they said, no, you can't do it. And Coursera, who was one of the companies that is affected, which was created by some professors at Stanford and now has professors all around the world contributing these fabulous courses and giving them away for free, put up a sign on their website that said, all of these great courses available to you for free unless you live in Minnesota, in which case you have to drive across the state line in order to open up your laptop. And of course, the regulators backed down in about a day when they realized how ridiculous it was. If you're offering it for free, nobody can be ripped off, right? I mean, so that's not the problem. And so, anyway, they're not getting it right, and they're not getting it right in the context of hotels. Hotel regulators are trying to enforce regulations on Airbnb. They're not getting it right in the context of transportation. There's a lot of entrenched interests in the transportation industry that have a lot of fixed costs in their existing market structures who are unhappy with the fact that has anybody ever used Uber here? I know you have, right? But it's an unbelievable service. You open up your smartphone, you push one button, and you see on a Google map where all the cars are around you. One of them lights up, and then you can watch it come to you. You get an estimate for exactly how long it takes. You jump in the car when it arrives, and it takes you wherever you want to go. And you get out at the end of it, and you never take out your wallet because it's all billed automatically based on the GPS coordinates that are in your phone, right? And so by linking the smartphone of the driver to the smartphone of the passenger, it's created a great service. Well, it's a much more efficient way to do it than the call centers that take your calls to order a cab and then dispatch on radios and have all those people involved. And so that's the challenge that these people are facing. This is an example in Chile. They shut down peer-to-peer lending. There was this Cumplo is a peer-to-peer lending service there. And again, they're saying, well, you're a bank, so you're not being regulated as a bank. How do we do that? Okay. So the thought is that Iceland might have some a freedom to innovate. And why might Iceland be in a position to lead here? You know, in the U.S., the way, and frankly, in many parts of the developed world, there's a relationship between the incumbents and the regulators where they've been working together for so long that the regulators actually have an interest in perpetuating the problem for which they are the solution. So there's that's called regulatory capture. And so if I'm regulating the taxi industry and all of a sudden my role has gone away, so I have kind of a natural interest in allying with the incumbents and preventing the emergence of these new network models. You know, there's also a legislative framework where, because of the way we finance campaigns in the US, there is the incumbents are the ones with the existing relationship with the politicians, and so whenever you need a new piece of legislation passed to essentially entrench the existing market structure, they're generally fairly happy to do that. So we're doing a bunch of things, and this gets to the question of why we're here. In the US, we are doing a number of things to try and encourage this evolution. First of all, we believe in this. We believe that that this evolution towards a more network-based economy is a good thing. We believe it lowers costs, it creates new services for consumers, it lowers the cost of those services for consumers, and it creates a lot of innovation. And all of that is good. It evolves the economy in sort of a graceful way. You know, it's the creative destruction of capitalism. It's happening incrementally. We worry that if we prop up the existing structure for too long, the transition, when it happens, will be more violent, more abrupt. More people will be, will have a bigger impact on the economy. So we'd rather see a sort of graceful transition from the existing models to the ones that take full advantage of the new infrastructure. Because of the resistance to that, we think we're doing a bunch of things to try and encourage that evolution. In the US, we're working in Washington and in state capitals and in cities to help them understand the value of these networks. And we're working, sort of the ground game is working with politicians to make that happen. We're also doing a lot of work with the companies. We're trying to create networks of what are called peer economy companies. These are these network economy companies. And we're trying to get them to reach out to their users. So Uber, as an example, which is one of the taxi companies, has done a fabulous job of that. When they get shut down in a city, they just send an email to all their users and say, you know how much fun it was to use your phone to call a cab? Well, that's not, no longer available until we get this rule changed or whatever. And so, and then they get a bunch of people sending emails to city councilmen, and they generally reverse themselves very quickly because they realize there's a voting population that cares about this. We've done this with other media sites when those were threatened by some copyright legislation, where the media sites have reached out, and the most famous example was the Pipa Sopa stuff in the US, where Wikipedia and other large sites went black and said, this is a problem, guys, let's pay attention to this. And by bringing a lot of public attention to it, it's had a real impact, right? But the last thing that we're doing, and the reason we're here, is a notion that we call creating jurisdictional competition. So if there is a jurisdiction anywhere on the planet who has a model that is friendlier to network innovation, a policy framework that is friendlier to network innovation, then what we think will happen is it will begin to attract investment and innovation to that model. And other jurisdictions will look at it and say, well, and you hear this all the time from politicians in the US, they would like to be able to say, they kind of recognize what they should be doing, and they would like to do the right thing, but they're limited in their degrees of flexibility because of the way their campaign was financed. But if they can go back to the incumbents and say, look, I'd really like to help you, but it doesn't make sense in the context of what consumers need or the context of global competition, because we're now seeing other policy frameworks around the world that make sense for networks, and we're beginning to see investment shift, and we can't allow that and remain competitive globally. So it's so the question is, where might somebody do that? And we think it's possible that would happen here. So we'd love to see Iceland and embrace the potential of networks and pioneer new models of regulation. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot when I talk about this is, are you suggesting that we create some kind of haven? And the answer to that is absolutely not. This is not about gambling or pornography or pirated content or anything like that, right? It's an opportunity. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get jurisdictions to recognize that you have a new opportunity to regulate with a network. If I go back to the example of Uber, the taxi service, historically, in order to regulate a taxi industry, you regulated entry to the industry. You had to have a medallion, and you had to have a license to provide the service. And you had to take a test before you could get the license, and then you had to obey a set of rules or they would take the license away. But the actual day-to-day activity of the taxis was very hard to monitor because you had a certain number of inspectors out on the street, and if you saw bad behavior, you'd write up that individual cab, but it was very difficult. In the new world, all of the taxi drivers are connected on a network, and all of their behavior is actually observed on the network. So as a natural byproduct of this network, there's data that tells you where the ride started, where the ride ended. There's a rating system, so the passenger rates the driver, and oh, by the way, the driver rates the passenger. And so you produce an enormous amount of data just naturally from these networks. So if you allow the networks to thrive, then if you say, I'm going to have a light touch regulation, allow these networks to exist, not define them as hotels or banks, but rather define them as networks. But in exchange, I want a certain amount of transparency. I want to be able to see the data. I want to, as a regulator, I want to understand what's going on in your network. And that's a really, it's a new way of thinking about regulation. Tim O'Reilly, who's the guy who coined the idea of Web 2.0, has also coined the notion of Regulation 2.0. And so it's now possible with these networks to regulate adaptively after the fact based on real data about what's really happening. And so what we're saying is, allow these networks to exist and then regulate them as required. So the reason that's a much bigger idea than most people, I mean, it seems kind of obvious, right? The reason it's a big idea is that in the US, as an example, these networks are very reluctant to acknowledge that they even have the data. It's obvious that they do, but they're reluctant to say that they do. They're really trying to argue that we're just intermediaries linking the lender and the borrower, the driver and the passenger. We're just networks. We don't really have anything to do with the service provider, right? The reason for that is that the legal framework, if they created what's called intermediary liability for the network, if the network became responsible for the behavior of the drivers, then they would never grow, right? And so the networks, because there's this threat of being made responsible for the behavior of all the endpoints of your network, they kind of say, no, we're just Switzerland. We don't know what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And what we're saying is that if you acknowledge that the network does actually know what's going on, if you can get them to acknowledge that if you say, we're not going to regulate you as a bank. If you say, once you admit that you know what's going on, then we're going to regulate you as a bank, you're out of business. And so there's a trade there that hasn't been made yet globally. And I think that's the opportunity to say, OK, no, we're going to regulate you, but we're going to regulate you in an innovative new way that takes advantage of the data. So, why are we here? What can you do? We would really thank you all for coming. There's been an effort here to create the Internet Policy Institute of Iceland. These are very complicated problems. There's no single answer. There's a whole bunch of issues. Let's just take the notion of regulating through the use of data. Well, there's personal privacy issues associated with that, right? I mean, what if if you could identify the specific passenger, and you could begin to see the patterns of where that passenger was going, and somehow that came out in the regulation and that was leaked into the marketplace in some way, that's a violation of personal privacy. So there's a bunch of very subtle, a bunch of very subtle problems here that we have to think about. So Kit, as an example, coming from the Berkman Center at Harvard, and we spent some time with a woman who is at the Center for Margot's Information Society Project at Yale. There are a bunch of resources in the US that are working on these problems that have been willing to spend time with the folks here in Iceland to help think these things through. But there needs to be some investment on this side. There needs to be some awareness of the opportunity, some investment in creating some infrastructure so that there's an opportunity to adapt anything that's coming out of the US to the specific context of Iceland and what Icelandic law is, and I know that we'll talk a little bit more about that, and how that fits within the framework of the EEA and the EU, and what's available, what's not available. And so we would really love to encourage you to support this. I mentioned the Harvard and Yale example. And then the last thing I think is really important is to recognize that Iceland, I really do believe Iceland has an opportunity to begin to serve a global market from here, but it needs continued investment in the infrastructure, the server infrastructure, the data centers, and it needs continued investment in the connectivity to the rest of the world, because if people begin to really believe that they can host their data here, the latency to get to other parts of the world is going to become more and more important. The capacity to serve other parts of the world is going to become more and more important. So I think it makes sense to spend a little time on that. So these are the principles. I've talked a lot about these as I've gone through. Think about a light touch regulation, transparency in exchange for a light touch regulation. Prioritize the interests and the rights of users. The regulation tends to prioritize the interests of the incumbents as opposed to the users. If you prioritize the users, you'll generally do the right thing. Encourage innovation. There's all of these things are a great way to think about this set of problems. So, as I mentioned, it's complicated. Embracing these principles requires thinking about the Icelandic legal framework and regulatory framework in all of these areas, and actually thinking beyond that to the degree that Iceland is moving in the direction of becoming a part of the EU or not. How does it fit with where you're headed? So it is complicated.